Has Boris Johnson pulled it off and secured a majority? Well, that's what the exit poll is saying.
How did Labour lose this election? More importantly, what is it about Labour, Corbyn, the left, even centrism that's turned people against it? Are we all mostly right-wingers now who are suddenly anti-migration, pro-austerity and pro-Brexit? Or is it more that woke politics became a tired and desperate attempt to win votes through labelling the public racist, uncompassionate and stupid in an aim to spend more and listen less? Well, let's go back to when it wasn't like this. When Blair won his thumping majority, it was on a manifesto of the centre-left. Now, most 2019 election analysis has viewed the extreme left socialism of Labour today and the centre-left politics of Blair, or even the Liberal Democrats, as separate entities. But the politicians of today share one common ancestor that started with Blair.
I just think that for a whole generation of people, they thought that if they arrived and did well, then you became a Tory. You know, it's like people used to say, well, if you bought your house, if you owned your own home, you were a Tory, which is crazy stuff.
No matter how he won that election, if it wasn't for Blair removing Labour's commitment for nationalisation and subsequent illegal invasion of Iraq, then we wouldn't have the Labour Party of today, and the Lib Dems wouldn't have gained so many seats in 2010 to form the coalition with the Tories. New Labour became popular by basing themselves on previous campaigns that created large Tory victories, well-educated, charismatic, intelligent leaders, but a new brand of Labour that wasn't just about creating strikes and economic recessions, as we had seen in the past, but about liberal yet competent reform, with the poor in mind first. But New Labour also had an element of seeing themselves as smarter, better, and above the electorate.
Good to see you. Thanks very much. That was a disaster. Well, just... Okay. Should never have put me with that woman. Whose idea was that?
I don't know, I didn't see.
It was Sue, I think. They're just ridiculous.
I'm not sure if they'll go with that one.
They will go with it.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman that said she used to be Labour. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I don't know why Sue pushed her up to it.
When Brown came to power and the expenses scandal happened, it already laid the seed that politicians were just in it for themselves. But the global financial crisis meant Labour had to borrow money to bail out the banks and left the UK with a huge deficit. Labour were no longer seen as competent with the economy, and their time in office threatened the working class jobs they'd spent years trying to defend. But it was the following Lib Dem Tory coalition that forever burned the reputation of the Lib Dems by supporting austerity and removing a commitment to student fees.
I'd like to take this opportunity to put a few things straight. When I meet people around the country, it's obvious that many of you have strong and pretty mixed reactions to some of the things that Liberal Democrats have done in government. Many of you tell me that you're glad that at a time of real economic uncertainty, we put aside our political differences to provide our country with stable leadership. But I also meet people who are disappointed and angry that we couldn't keep all our promises, above all our promise not to raise tuition fees. And to those people, I say this: we made a promise before the election that we would vote against any rise in fees under any circumstances. But that was a mistake. It was a pledge made with the best of intentions, but we shouldn't have made a promise we weren't absolutely sure we could deliver. I shouldn't have committed to a policy that was so expensive when there was no money around, not least when the most likely way we'd end up in government was in coalition with Labour or the Conservatives, who were both committed to put fees up. I know that we fought to get the best policy we could in those circumstances, but I also realise that isn't the point. There's no easy way to say this. We made a pledge, we didn't stick to it, and for that I am sorry.
Then, by 2014, came the Scottish independence referendum. This helped legitimise and promote the SNP, so that by 2015, Labour were pretty much wiped out in Scotland. It was already clear that by 2015, north of the border, voters were willing to support radical change in the form of a pro-independence party in exchange for devolved representation, and the only way voters in the north of England and Wales could do that was by voting for Brexit. The SNP and independence to Scotland played out like a prelude to the rise of the UKIP and Brexit in England. The collapse of mining led to a collapse in the trade unions, Labour's main support. New Labour's free market rhetoric failed to reverse Thatcher's reforms, and created a disenchantment that, with the Tory government of the time, made Scotland feel that it needed a new, locally centric voice. If it wasn't for Labour's neglect of Scottish needs and Miliband's poor campaign, we wouldn't be talking about independence today, and the Remain voice in Scotland would be pro-union.
Do you accept that when Labour was last in power, it overspent?
No, I don't, and I know you may not agree with that. But let me just say very clearly.
Even with all the borrowing, year on year on year.
No, I don't. Let me tell you, because there are schools that have been rebuilt in our country. There are hospitals that were rebuilt. There were Sure Start centres that were built, which would not have happened. And so, look, I don't agree with that. And let me just explain to you the way I see it. There was a global financial crisis which caused the deficit to rise. Now, look, President Obama isn't dealing with a high deficit because we built more schools and hospitals. He's dealing with a high deficit because there was that global financial crisis. So spending's got to fall. I say to this gentleman here, spending's got to fall. And that's why we will reduce spending.
It was clear Ed Miliband was simply just a change too soon in what had already been a relatively successful Tory-Lib Dem coalition, which did successfully reduce the deficit. Miliband simply, through defending past Labour governments, skirted around the biggest issue of the time, the deficit. And like Corbyn of today, with Brexit, he failed to engage the public.
And if we vote leave and take back control, I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
Now you could blame the Tories for Brexit. After all, they proposed a referendum. They were split on the issue for decades. They shut the mining industries and factories in the north and Wales. They created austerity and then haven't really helped improve the north with empty promises like the Northern Powerhouse. But Labour haven't either. From the year 2000 onwards, the streets have gotten emptier of shops, immigration has risen massively, and terrorism has increased. All, in part, to blame for Labour being economically incompetent during the economic crisis, too liberal on migration when the EU expanded, and failing in foreign interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
For many people who crave authenticity, Jeremy Corbyn is the real deal. This place may look affluent and leafy, but there's a lot of urban poverty, and he has been, over years, a tireless campaigner for those people. But for others in the Labour Party, he is terrifyingly left-wing. One former cabinet minister told me today, antediluvian doesn't begin to cover it when you get to Jeremy Corbyn. Another said if he took over, it would be the party led by Karl Marx. One senior figure said to me that if Jeremy Corbyn took over, they'd leave the party.
Jeremy Corbyn, the antithesis of Tony Blair, now leads his party.
I say thank you in advance to us all working together to achieve great victories, not just electorally for Labour, but emotionally for the whole of our society, to show we don't have to be unequal, it doesn't have to be unfair, poverty isn't inevitable, things can and they will change.
In 2015, momentum was created and Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. Corbyn was popular because he wasn't anything like the New Labour approved centre-left Blairite type person. He didn't try to look like Blair and was a nationalism supporting pacifist and socialist. The perfect antidote for Labour to move on from its failures of the past, but also a highlighter for its divisions.
I still believe that if the centre puts forward strong radical solutions, but which are based on what I would call, solutions that align with the future, I still think that position beats everything else. For most of my political life, I've been saying
I think this is the right way to go, and what's more, it's the only way to win an election.
Over the years, I and many others have been very critical of many decisions taken by the EU. And I remain very critical of its shortcomings, from its lack of democratic accountability to the institutional pressures to deregulate or privatise public services. So, Europe needs to change. But that change can only come from working with our allies in the European Union to achieve it.
In 2016, Corbyn failed by not campaigning enthusiastically enough the way his party wanted him to remain in the EU. This left questions. Was he really a Remainer? Did he have the authority and commitment to lead the party to an election victory? And so, a leadership contest was held. Once again, the divisions in the party were highlighted between the Blairites and the Corbynistas. Corbyn, of course, won, and when May became leader of the Conservatives, he could at least remind the public of her reputation as Home Secretary and the Tory reputation of austerity.
So we want a people's vote for all the reasons that most of you are very well familiar with. But it's not just about it's the only way now for the government to get out of this unholy, unprecedented mess. But it's actually an opportunity for the British people to have what I think they have a right to have, and that's a final say. Now they know what Brexit looks like, and now they, I think, begin to appreciate that the current deal that we have with the EU is the best deal we can ever get, for all the reasons which you know and have been well rehearsed.
Behind the scenes after the Brexit vote was a much more conniving and divisive style of politics. Momentum were threatening to deselect Labour candidates, anti-Semitism was plaguing the Labour Party, and there was a growing movement for a people's vote, a second referendum on Brexit. The Labour Party, on top of the Blairite divisions, now had to cross the new divide between Remainers in the south and Leavers in the north. But May called an election, having said that she wouldn't. She campaigned poorly, came up with what was later labelled the dementia tax, and had a lot of Tory reputational damage to defend. Corbyn, meanwhile, could stand with large crowds of people, looking like somebody extreme enough, but also different enough to deliver the change the North desperately needed and expressed through the Brexit vote.
Thank you for giving me a few minutes, and remember, this election is about you!
And what we're saying is the Conservatives are the largest party. Note, they don't have an overall majority at this stage.
But when the result came in, it brought a huge condition to Brexit that meant a deal with the EU had to be approved by the DUP amongst other fractions of the Tory party. So why did May still win the most seats in 2017, despite having such a bad campaign? Well, Miliband in 2015 left Labour with the worst defeat since 1983, so despite gaining 30 seats, they still had a lot of ground to make up. Labour won 40% of the vote share, but only won 4 more seats compared to Brown in 2010 when he had 29% of the vote share. Labour were already losing votes to the Tories in the Midlands and the North, and simply only shored up its vote share in the seats that they already held. Ultimately, the result proved that Labour in opposition couldn't deliver the type of Brexit that they promised the voters in the 2017 election. Labour wanted a customs union and single market style deal. Theresa May's backstop offered this and they voted against it. They had a chance to sit down with May and do a deal, but again they pulled out of those talks. Along with the Lib Dems and the SNP, they continually added amendments to block the various votes that went through Parliament. They constantly called for a general election, right up until Boris Johnson got a second reading of a deal approved by Parliament. And then, all of a sudden, they got scared.
Mr Corbyn, Lib Dems and the SNP put forward election plans for the 9th of December. They say this is contingent on Brexit being extended to the 31st of January, and Boris Johnson's Brexit deal isn't discussed and voted on in the run-up to this election. Is Labour going to back this plan?
I think it's a bit of a stunt by the Lib Dems and the SNP. The reality is we've got to have no deal completely off the table and that whole threat removed before anything else, because of the danger to our economy, to jobs, to trade, to medicine supplies. And I think Johnson is playing with fire here by messing around and still saying he's thinking about this.
Is Brexit delayed until the 31st of October taking no deal off the table in your book?
No, because it's still there in his mind, it's still there in the bill, and it's still there as a threat. It's got to be completely removed before we'll support an election. We are ready for an election. We're going to go out there with a very strong message of how we transform our society to end inequality and injustice and deal with the devastating poverty that so many people face. We always said we wanted an election. We do want an election, but we wanted no deal to be taken off the table. We've now had confirmation from all 28 EU member states that no deal is off the table.
Labour, instead of supporting leaving the EU, were now supporting a second referendum with an option to remain. And nobody, publicly in the Labour Party, said that they would support leaving. Parliament had paralysed Britain, and Labour weren't offering a solution to that paralysation that wasn't going to take less than 6 months. But by the 2019 election, it wasn't just Brexit that made voters turn on Labour and the Lib Dems. The Remain vote was already looking split in two, and hung Parliament was on the cards, and the country just wanted a working government.
Labour's money man is adding the internet to rail, water, energy and the mail he'd like to take into public hands.
Labour had put lots of nationalisation policies like free broadband all together in a bowl, like having ice cream, chocolate, gummy bears and strawberry laces all together, and in comparison to a ready meal Brexit, it just seemed like overkill. The individual components, like nationalising the rail industry, weren't necessarily bad, but altogether it seemed like spending too much in a time when the country still had a deficit from 2008.
We respect the result of the referendum. There was a referendum, there was a campaign fought, and the people as a whole voted that we should leave the European Union. So therefore Article 50 will be invoked and there will be negotiations. But we are part of the negotiations and we're very tough on this. We want to see Britain having a trading relationship with Europe and protections maintained for British workers.
But we will not let it happen. As Brighton's Peter Kyle has said, we must fight with every fibre of our beings to say between now and the 31st of October and afterwards, if there's a general election, that any terms of departure from any government must go back to the people for a final say. There should be an option to remain, and I, for one, will be out there campaigning to remain.
In 2017, Labour wanted a jobs-first Brexit, but by 2019, they not only left Brexit till page 89 of their manifesto, but they added a second referendum with an option to remain to their Brexit policies. So it seemed like they were backtracking on delivering Brexit at all. This wasn't a U-turn per se, but a 3-point turn on the electorate's decision. They also made a direct threat on working class jobs in the electricity, gas, rail and postal industries that relied on a degree of capitalism and a strong economy by wanting them in the power of the state. Since 2008, Labour was still not trusted on economic competency, and the amount of spending proposed was simply a threat. But most importantly, all those policies just gave more attack lines for the Tories. So when Boris said,
"Going to get Brexit done,"
the only way Labour could oppose them was through attacking that sentiment.
Johnson's Trump deal Brexit puts a price tag on our National Health Service. So we'll say it again and again until the message gets through to the White House. Our NHS is not for sale.
Making it seem like he supported remaining in the EU despite saying that he would remain neutral on the issue. Or if he didn't support remaining on the EU, he at least supported renegotiating, which itself meant that he approved the past few months of parliamentary paralysation. But Corbyn also repeatedly has failed the Remain vote by not allowing Remainers anything other than remaining on the condition of socialism. Corbyn released Russian documents attacking Trump in order to try and defend the NHS from being sold off, but supporting the idea that he favours our enemies instead of our allies. But whether it through just not being very charismatic, his dealing of anti-Semitism and Brexit, or the divisions within his party between Momentum and the Blairites, Labour in 2019 are simply not popular.
Has Boris Johnson pulled it off and secured a majority? Well, that's what the exit poll is saying. Boris Johnson has gambled and won. He has purged his party and still come out on top with a majority to force through his Brexit.
The Labour Party used to represent working class voters who were far from the corrupt aristocracy. But the overwhelming story of this decade is that of scandal and corruption, events happening that can be labelled with an ism or an obia, whether that be the paedophilia of Jimmy Savile, Michael Jackson and grooming gangs, Islamophobia within the Tory party and post-terrorism, anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, sexism of Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, which created the Me Too movement, feminism and the backlash to all of that, racism in the form of hate crimes and in American policing, the populism of Trump and Brexit, transphobia, homophobia, classism and socialism. With social media, these debates were forced online into disgusting echo chambers of the far left and far right. Labour became so pacifist, they appeared to sympathise with terrorists. So anti-xenophobic and anti-racist, they seemed unpatriotic. So anti-capitalist, they associated capitalism with Jews and became anti-Semitic. And so anti-establishment, they failed to engage with the media and the system to sell their messages. Labour tried so hard to defend minority communities and attack discrimination of any form, they therefore drove the debate into ever more isolationist echo chambers that instead of uniting the country, divided it and insulted the communities outside of the ones that they were defending, and forgetting about the real issues that aren't expressed in scandals and isms. The white working classes, the Jews, the billionaires and the Leave voters all suffered as a result of Labour's one-sided attacks on discrimination. Now rightly, the world and Britain has become more liberal in the past decade, but it has come at a price where everybody feels attacked when addressing what can be done and said about issues that they care about. When Britain voted to leave the EU, we were told mainly by the left about why it might alienate migrant communities, why the public were misinformed, why our economy might suffer, why we should therefore rethink the question. All of this in aim to blame the establishment and defend the ordinary working class voter. But the voters didn't take it like that. They interpreted it as being told that they're stupid, racist, delusional and unable to make decisions, as Brexit was a democratic majority vote. The social media echo chambers even went further with those labels, and the debate was forced on the UK despite Britain already voting to leave the EU. The Remain argument still appeals more to the middle classes, who aren't living in areas massively affected from a lack of investment, and who study at university the economic benefits of the EU. It also benefited the mainstream media to perpetuate and complicate the debate for ratings and newspaper sales. Meanwhile, for the people in poorer areas, they see corruption in both the mainstream media and upper classes, a disdain that doesn't listen to their needs and looks down on them. The reality being they simply wanted to express a change they expected to happen, and when it didn't, they saw the crowds of Remainers, MPs and media entities and noticed how unjust it was that those people could afford to take the time off work to put forward an argument that affected them the most, when they themselves couldn't afford to make the counter-argument. Even Leave protests were hijacked by the far right, and there was no platform for expression for Leave voters other than the ballot box. The people out there are more worried about who they are and where they come from, and in 2019 they voted on those old-fashioned grounds. Ultimately, the working classes feel more represented outside the EU than they do inside the EU, and Labour never got that. They were trying to force yet another debate on top of Brexit about socialism. The SNP did get it with the Scots, because the Scottish people feel more Scottish than they do British, and it doesn't necessarily mean they want independence. The left need to learn that politics is made in bricks and mortar, not dissertations and essays. Brexit wasn't a racist economic vote, it was a geopolitical vote to leave the EU. To win an election, you have to get with the times and represent areas by geography, not by theory. Labour policies simply just felt theoretical, and instead of attacking the establishment with these dissertation-style isms, they've started attacking the electorate, and they've forced a backlash. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.